recent update of some of the events we organized. For our past events, we also have video links to our YouTube channel. You can watch some of the recordings of our previous events. Okay, now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Professor Pauline Leonard, who is a professor of sociology, director of the Web Science Institute, and director of the Work Futures Research Center at the University of Southampton. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and of the Royal Society of Arts. Pauline's principal research interests are in diversity and the changing nature of work. She has published widely on gender and organizations, race and professional migration, age, employability, technology, and careers. And as the China-wide team, we read several of her papers on whiteness in post-colonial Hong Kong. And other examples of publication includes a book co-authored with Conway called Migration, Space, Transnational Identities, the British in South Africa. Another book co-edited with Angela Xiamen called Destination China, Immigration to China in the Post-Reform Era. So we are very honored and excited to invite Professor Leonard to give us a talk today. Title is Because I'm a Foreigner, White Migrants' Navigations of the Chinese State. Pauline, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam, and everyone for your very kind invitation to come and talk to you today, for the lovely introduction. So thank you. I'm delighted to be here today and to talk about some new reflections on the research I conducted with English language teachers about 5 years ago now, some of which is presented in the book I co-edited with Angela Xiamen, which Sam's just mentioned, and this was published last year. So I've recently gone back to this research to explore in greater depth experiences of international migrants in relation to the Chinese state and immigration policies and processes. And this is work which is still very much ongoing and in process. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss this with you as a really exciting and cutting edge group looking at these issues in China. So just by way of background, this is the book that I published with Angela. And as Xiamen said, I've previously conducted research in Hong Kong and South Africa on professional migration and how aspects of identity such as race, in particular whiteness, nationality, gender and age shape the migration experiences and performances before joining forces with Angela, who was researching international migration in Xiamen. And Angela had told me about the boom in English language teachers in Xiamen and how the rapid rise in numbers and their tendency to live together in close proximity in the same neighborhood had contributed to the English teachers gaining quite a poor reputation. Some xenophobia and interracial hostility had been demonstrated within the local community, and there had even been some violence. The English language teachers tended to be imagined as unqualified, poor quality migrants who didn't always behave well. And this was causing some concern and resentment in the local community, which wanted to crack down on the influx of foreigners, many of whom were understood to be illegals. This chimed with a media campaign which appeared in China in 2016 called the Dangerous Love Campaign, which warned local Chinese women of the dangers of becoming romantically involved with Western English language teachers on the grounds that they could be spies. Women should be aware of falling for their seeming friendship and romantic gestures because what they really wanted was secret intelligence. So this tapped into some of the ongoing discourses of suspicion and hostility. But at the same time, rather contradictorily, as I say, English language teaching was booming and numbers of international migrants to China were rising. So I decided to look at this set of contradictory issues in greater depth and won some research funding to do so. So while certainly not a new phenomenon, English language teachers have been coming to China since the 1960s and the opening up of China in the 1970s, English language teaching has boomed over the last decade. In 2015, it was estimated that more than 300 million Chinese were learning English. And it's difficult to ascertain exact figures because the statistics aren't really there. But in 2012, estimates of native English speakers teaching English in China stood at 100,000. And this number will certainly have grown significantly since, as it's also estimated that at least 1,000 new English teachers are hired each month. So if you add in the numbers of non-native speakers, English teachers, which are estimated to be another 80% of English teachers, then the numbers will be even larger. So this explosion has meant that young Westerners keen to travel and experience China, as well as escape the regular recessions and periods of unemployment which hit Western economies, can quickly and easily find work in the many private language schools springing up all over China. It's clear that this is really big business. A quick search of the internet reveals numerous adverts for young English-speaking people to come to China and teach English, sometimes and sometimes not offering training. Within the English language teaching profession generally, key criteria for selection and recruitment rest on the possession of formal and academic qualifications, such as a university degree, a teaching qualification, and depending on the level of the role, perhaps in addition, several years of teaching experience. However, the surge in demand for learning English in China, and especially from native English speaking teachers, has led to diversification or even a dilution of these criteria and standards, and a broader range of teachers and schools to be involved in the delivery of English language education. Just a quick word on my methodology. I followed a qualitative biographical approach. I've conducted 17 interviews to date, but I hope to conduct perhaps a few more. I took a real cross-section of gender, 11 male and 6 female, and nationality. I'll show you the range of people I talked to shortly. All my respondents were white, bar one, and most were under 30, although I did talk to 5 men between the ages of 30 and 50. I did a mixture of face-to-face interviews while I was in Xiamen, as well as Skype interviews, talking to a range of teachers in other places in China. So this is an overview of my sample, and it can be seen that even in a sample of this size, there's real diversity in terms of age, nationality, education and qualifications, previous experience and length of stay in China. So in terms of my talk today, there are 2 aspects of my analysis that I would like to focus on. First is the fact that there's real diversity in who becomes an English language teacher in China, and I will present a typology of the different characteristics that my sample reveals. And second is the way that this diversity relates to differences in experiences in terms of perspectives of, relations towards and treatment by the Chinese state. I'm interested in how participants conceptualize and construct this relationship. And I'm going to deploy the concept of double voicing to analyze this, and I'll explain a bit more about this later. My thematic analysis reveals that in terms of qualifications and experience, far from being a unified group of untrained chancers, as the media represents them, my participants can be seen to fall into 4 groups, and I'll discuss these in turn. Firstly, what I called old professionals. This group possessed established and good education and teaching qualifications, including recognized TEFL qualifications, previous experience, often at senior level, highly professional and high standards of teaching and learning. Native English speaking and whiteness were also important, however. Our interviews often covered aspects such as pedagogy, curriculum design, resources, school structures, delivery. This was a highly informed group who really wanted to talk about their craft. And this group was often motivated by career aspirations, although sometimes in combination with personal factors, such as the desire to use skills in a new context, or perhaps recovering from divorce. Importantly, they knew how to recognize and select a good school, what to look for and what to avoid. It was clear that this group worked in very good private schools, were highly paid, and enjoyed good conditions such as accommodation, paid leave, and flights. So example is Stacey, who's 30 years old. She's a British graduate and had studied English and linguistics at university. Wanting to travel, she studied a TEFL course in Europe, which was good quality. It was all classroom based with lots of teaching practice and feedback on her performance. She now enjoys excellent paying conditions in China, including flight and provided accommodation. She was immediately impressed by the school. She said, everyone here is so friendly. The school was amazing, so clean and nice looking and modern. Everyone's so accommodating and helpful, and everything was just so easy. Incredibly welcoming atmosphere. And I think instantly I was, yes, I can quite easily be here for a long time. She recognizes a typical image of an English language teacher as someone who is young, but she's noticing that there's been a slight increase recently in older people coming out. But I think that's because they've started to offer more money if you come here with experience. So it's starting to attract people who've been teaching for a little bit longer. So an example here is Connor, now in his 50s, who originally obtained a geography degree in Manchester in the UK, then trained to become a primary school teacher. Within 5 years, he was a deputy head teacher in the UK, where he remained for about 20 years. Then in his late 40s, his marriage ended. He got divorced. His children had grown up and left the family home. So he said, so the family split, and that was a big thing, the family splintering. This gave me a choice to either stay at home and cry or do something interesting with my life. So I thought, where do I want to go? And there was no question in my mind that I wanted to go to China, because all my life I've heard about the good behavior of the children. So China I knew would be a good place to live. I chose Xiamen because of the weather pattern. The city wasn't too big, and I read blogs on the internet saying it was a friendly city, not too far from anywhere. My next group are new professionals. These also tended to be slightly older, often in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, with previous work experience, but not in teaching. So in contrast to the old professionals, new professionals typically are not trained teachers and often not graduates, although many had other professional qualifications and skills from previous careers. So this group had come into English language teaching following a career change, but perhaps as they were older and had experience of professional careers, they displayed a very disciplined approach to gaining training and qualifications. They were now very committed to their new careers and aspired to be very good teachers. However, their lack of teaching qualifications meant that they did not tend to be able to access work in the very top quality schools, but often in second tier schools. For example, Claudia is an Australian in her late 20s. She now works for a private language school in Xiamen, teaching mainly children. She came to China as a dancer, but after several years of dancing and dance teaching, she suffered an ankle injury, which meant that she could no longer dance professionally. She enjoyed living in China and did not want to leave. So she explains, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and everyone said, why don't you teach? And I was like, no, but it kind of seems the in thing to do. She applied to the school where her flatmate worked, as they were desperately in need of native English speakers. She was accepted immediately, but the school did insist she do a week's observation of other teachers before being given a class of her own. Claudia was already quite confident and used to being in front of an audience, teaching dance and working to improve herself. So she says, it's been a massive learning curve for me because obviously it's not something I've been trained in. But I said that from day one in my interview, I said, I haven't been teaching English, but I have been teaching children, and English is my native tongue. I'm willing to work hard, and I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to take it all in. She's now studying online for a TEFL qualification and reflects, it's funny because obviously I've had quite a transition from the club scene to this new life, but this job is very rewarding. I didn't think I would love it as much as I do. Mark is British and he's in his mid-50s. His early career was in the army, after which he worked in business all over the world. He eventually returned to the UK but missed living abroad. One of his friends was a TEFL teacher and suggested he train too. He found the qualification hard work, but he did well and came top of the class. He felt his army background helped because he said, I was very disciplined. He was highly motivated and immediately got a job in China. He explains, I chose China simply because my EFL teacher said the business is big out there. It'll be easy to get a job and you need 2 years experience for anyone to accept you anywhere else. Mark hit lucky with his first job, his career took off, and for the past 20 years, he's worked in senior positions in a range of language schools and universities. He's married a Chinese woman, also a teacher, and together they've now set up their own language school. He has seen a lot of bad practice over the way, but he aims to run this very professionally, his own school. He says, I realized very quickly that if you're going to do this, your plan has to be a good school. It has to be high quality. We realize that the quality is not the walls or the doors, it's the teachers, but finding teachers is a very difficult thing. I regard myself as a professional and a good teacher. So compared to the old professionals, the new professionals enjoy less benefits. They're not in the top flight schools, but they earn enough money to pay for their own accommodation, which is not provided, and other living expenses. My third group is what I call the CV builders. This group were younger than the previous two groups, ranging in age from 18 to their mid-20s. The group that I put into this category were all white and from countries such as the US and the UK, and consisted of graduates and postgraduates, perhaps unable to find work of choice in the West due to economic recession, as well as gap year students getting some experience before going to university in their home countries. So Xiamen, for example, is a white American and a graduate of Chinese, which she studied for 5 years, although she's never previously visited China. Now, having graduated, she's come to try to get more fluent in Chinese. Her aim for the future is to go in a career towards maybe teaching Chinese in America after becoming fluent enough. Or I'd like to interpret or translate or work for a government, like work for the embassy. All of this is open to me. Xiamen is just teaching English to pay for her time in China, although she's now finding she rarely gets the chance to speak much Chinese. Having had no previous teaching experience, Xiamen finds teaching very challenging. She says, I was very thrown in and the Chinese communication is quite poor. So I was just like, maybe they just assume I know what I'm doing, or they assume that if I didn't, I would ask. So after struggling for a week and a half or 2 weeks, I finally was just like, I have to man up and figure this out so that I'm not stressed, because it was just stressing me out. Also in this group were the 5 or 6 young people I interviewed who were only 18 or 19 years old. I spoke to them when they were now back in the UK in their first year at university, having spent a year teaching English in really quite remote rural Chinese state schools. The young people were all seeking experience working abroad before they started university, and they had to pay and raise 6,000 euros to pay an agency in the UK, which in return offered to find them employment and oversee their time in China. After a brief week's teacher training in the UK, the young people arrived in Beijing and were then put on long train journeys, some lasting over 2 days, to remote rural Chinese schools. They were part of a Chinese government scheme to bring native English speakers to schools across China. And they found out that they were actually being paid by the Ministry of Education. Their job was to teach English to classes of 50 to 60 children. As you can imagine, they found this quite challenging. So George says, trying to teach, it had to be 60 14-year-olds, no matter where in the world, it's not going to be easy. So some of the classes were more like just right out of control. Although provided with accommodation, this was not of high standard. George says, when we got to the apartment, it was filthy and not furnished. It kind of took quite a while to sort ourselves out. Their experiences were sometimes difficult, in spite of the fact they were working in state schools, they didn't have proper visas, and they had to keep paying themselves for going in and out of China to Hong Kong to renew their tourist visas. However, they all stuck with it, knowing their aim was to seek China and do something different, and at the end of the year, they would be returning to the UK. At the age of 18, they were unlikely to be providing high quality teaching, but their white faces and the fact that they were native English speakers meant that they were sometimes treated as celebrities. My final group were those that ended up teaching English completely by chance, having come to China as tourists, but open to seeking out any opportunities that were going for foreigners. While many in this group were white native English speakers, this was not always the case. And amongst my interviewees were a German woman and a Turkish woman, both teaching English and passing as native English speakers. For the white native speakers in this group, it was their race and nationality that brought what could be called native capital, providing them with the resources which Chinese students and their parents desire and are happy to pay for, sometimes at the expense of proper skills and qualifications. For example, John, a white Canadian in his early 30s, arrived in China 10 years ago, having lost all his money overnight in a casino. He had seen a TV program about China and, having nothing to lose, thought it was about time he saw more of the world than the Canadian prairies. He says, I was 22 at the time, still quite young and whatnot, and I figured, well, I've never seen much of the world, so I decided to come on out. What I noticed is, like a lot of the people that decide to stay, you kind of thrive off like having the difficult life where everything's a challenge. I noticed every time that I went back, it was just too easy, too mundane. So I kind of just learned to enjoy that. John traveled around China for a while and then got a job in a public school where he found you were kind of treated like a superstar. That's since kind of changed a bit, but the main thing was there was absolute interest in me because I was white. I could speak English. But his lack of training meant that he didn't have any skills to kind of fall back on. So it's all song and dance. It's literally just entertaining them. Trying to get 60 people to talk to you is impossible. In some contrast is Asli, a Turkish, non-white, non-native speaker woman in her late 20s. She explains that she was in China and was in a bit of a personal crisis. I couldn't stay in Turkey anymore. I was so uncomfortable with everything. I just found myself in China just taking time, and I decided to stay. I mean, it was not just a visit. I planned to find a job while I'm in China, but if you're foreign and not white in China, it can be really difficult. Well, for me at least, because I don't have a British or US passport, it just makes things really difficult to find jobs. Although not a native speaker, Asli speaks good English. She tells me she taught herself by watching American and British comedy shows on the internet. Her lack of native English speaking and nationality have caused her difficulties, however, in securing jobs, particularly jobs in good schools operating visa systems properly. Her tourist visa ran out, meaning that she had to return to Turkey. And here she didn't know if she could find another legal job because although there are many jobs, they're not legal. Coming from Turkey, I just can't get long visas and I'm not comfortable being on a tourist visa, working at the same time because it's so stressful. I would be looking over my shoulder. Asli did manage to get a job over the internet and returned to China, but the school she was working was not of good quality and did not provide a proper visa. She found she had to travel to lots of different schools in neighbouring cities and pay for herself to get there, teaching different classes all the time. Without her visa, she was vulnerable, and when she complained, they fired her. However, she explained she doesn't have proper release documents, so she's now stuck in China, working illegally at a number of different schools. So I would like to turn to exploring how this very diverse group of teachers constructed their experiences of China, and in particular their employers and the Chinese authorities. The real diversity in this group is an indication of the many different forms of white migration in China. Consequently, there was also diversity in terms of their experiences in relation to the Chinese authorities, including immigration officials, police and security and the education system, as well as the local communities in which they lived. A challenge for all migrants is to negotiate what are called subjective viability in their new context. And what I mean by this is a livable identity, which is both acceptable to the host country, as well as a subjectivity, which one feels is viable to oneself. So subjective viability is understood here as the basis of reciprocal recognition, that is a mutual accordance of rights and responsibilities that's always dialogical, situated in cultural and social contexts, and generated through embodied practice. In China, race in intersection with nationality and native English speaker status constitute important components of the dynamics of recognition and the situated positioning through which relations of both value and vulnerability are experienced and enacted. The terms according to which migrants hope to be affirmed as having value are not race neutral. This means that race is central to the identity work which they undertake in China and how they strive to be perceived by the other. We all desire recognition of ourselves as socially and culturally viable, and this desire situates us within complex and dynamic relations of both vulnerability and resistance. So in order to explore migrants' constructions of subjective viability within their navigations of the Chinese state and authorities, I am proposing that Bakhtin's concept of double voicing provides a useful tool of analysis. As I'll now go on to explain, double voicing is a discursive resource which can be mobilized within social interactions to achieve particular outcomes and effects. It's embedded within and inflected by power relations. So I'll start to my explanation of double voicing with a quote from Claudia again. Claudia said, "Purely because I'm a foreigner, I had to wait a week to get my VPN back. And purely because I'm a foreigner, I had to go with my passport. Just stupid segregation like that, like we can't access certain things on our phones because we don't have an ID card." So there's stuff like that which starts, eating away at you. So in my interviews, as well as in all our everyday lives, many of us will use double voicing in our talk. In this example, Claudia displays irritation at her regular loss of internet services, meaning she can't talk to her family and friends at home on Facebook or Instagram. She uses linguistic expertise in using a double-voiced explanation which anticipates what she sees as the likely views of Chinese officials and the reasons behind what she perceives as discriminatory treatment towards foreign migrants. So this small comment, "because I am a foreigner," indexes the speaker's reflexive ability to enter the world of Chinese officialdom as a way of building solidarity with me, her interviewer, who is also a foreigner in China, as well as her other expat friends. We all use double voicing in diverse ways within our spoken interactions in our everyday lives. What I mean by this is that we bring in the voices of others as well as our own voice to construct meanings and social relations. As such, there are intricate relationships between the use of double voicing in everyday talk and the ways in which speakers are relatively positioned by power, race, and gender within specific contexts. So double voicing can provide a rich understanding of the nuanced ways in which linguistic interactions are negotiated and identities are constructed within everyday settings in social and professional life. Double voicing means that when a person speaks, they have a heightened awareness of and responsiveness to the views, concerns, and agendas of others and their own power in relation to this, according to the interplay of social categories such as gender, age, race and ethnicity, profession, and status. This is then reflected in the different ways in which they adjust their language to construct subjective viability and navigate their position in relation to the Chinese authorities. The forms and functions of double voicing are quite complex and multiple, and I haven't got time to cover them all fully in this talk, obviously. So here I'm going to focus on the following four principal types. Firstly, authoritative, which is to heighten impact and display personal power, especially if this is threatened. Anticipatory, which is to anticipate and dilute possible criticism. Corrective, which is to correct or repair a mistake or error, usually one's own. And parody or mimicry, which is to mimic the voice of the other, to criticize it. In what follows, I'd like to make the case that double voicing helps to expose a relationship between the power and status possessed by different teachers and their understandings of and relations to Chinese authorities, their Chinese employers, and Chinese people. So I'm going to be drawing on my interviews again now, and I'll turn to provide some examples of double voicing used within each category. It's important to say at this point that while examples of each type being used individually can be found, various forms of double voicing may well be used together in the same piece of talk, as I will demonstrate. So we'll start again with the old professionals. Well-qualified teachers, such as the old professionals, were the group that used double voicing the least. This finding is in common with other research into double voicing, which finds that more powerful groups, white men, for example, tend to use double voicing significantly less than groups with less power, such as women and ethnic minorities. Where instances of double voicing can be found, it's predominantly authoritative in style, revealing senses of autonomy and power. So Connor, who we met earlier, the deputy head of the school in the UK, reveals in his use of double voicing in his interview that he was in charge of the selection process in terms of which kind of school he would work for in China. He says this school was very well reviewed. It had a very good reputation. The way I looked at it was that I couldn't find anything bad about the school. I just kept searching and searching and searching for bad reviews and nothing. Searching on the internet is vital. He displays power through the way he double voices the views and experiences of others to show how he used these to inform his ability to choose to be employed in a top quality school and access good working conditions. In terms of Connor's relationship to both China and the Chinese English language system, it's clear that Connor felt that he would and could dictate the terms. He knows he's a valuable asset, so he's able to call the shots. Stacey, who we also met earlier, the one who had a degree in English and linguistics, also shows how the voices of her social networks led to her accessing a top quality job. She says 2 of my friends were actually at the school in China that I'm at now, and we're just raving about it, nothing but praise for it, and said I should go out there. And I said, yes, I had an interview and that's what happened. She also double voices other less confident applicants to show how, in comparison, she felt confident and empowered. As far as I know, a lot of people who come out here do send emails to lots of people who are already here and say, is it okay? Am I going to be safe? But I didn't really have to do that. So I never really had too many worries about coming out here. I was lucky in that I already had friends out here, so I knew it was all legitimate and stuff like that. That never crossed my mind. So I was quite quick in saying yes and accepting it. While Stacey puts her ability to secure a job at a top quality school partly down to luck of having friends already working at a good school, double voicing both her knowledgeable friends and more vulnerable applicants is a demonstration of her personal power. She uses the comparison of an alternative, very different and less powerful subject position to emphasize her own confidence in her position in China as legitimate and secure. But noteworthy in the old professionals talk was the absence of references to the Chinese state and any problems encountered with visas or residence. Perhaps this was an indication that they felt unthreatened in terms of their relationship towards the Chinese state. They were also positive about their relationships with the Chinese education system and their Chinese students, although they revealed little awareness of the political and social intricacies of race and migration issues and relations in China. Again, perhaps this is because they do not have to become involved or take interest, safe in their positions as they are able to live in a bubble and rarely come up against the authorities. So this group embody the type of good migrant that China welcomes. Double voicing reveals how they drew on the voices of other privileged white English teachers to access this position and the sense of empowerment within this. So now to the new professionals. This group also drew on authoritative double voicing, but this often took a very different form than that used by the old professionals. So whereas Connor and Stacey appropriate other voices to support their purpose and identity making, for this group, the second voice becomes the object of criticism and attack. Bakhtin describes the rhetorical art of parody, where a type of speech or behavior is mimicked in order to criticize it. An example is provided by Mark, who's taken a great deal of interest in the social relations between China and its international migrants over the years. For example, like many host societies, China attempts to restrict in-migration to skilled migrants with the skills needed to boost the Chinese economy. However, the visa system is unevenly managed across bureaucratic authorities, and it's relatively easy, as discussed above, for language schools and other employers to bypass the system using tourist visas. The state responds with waves of investigation into the legal status of foreigners. Schools that are renowned for hiring teachers illegally are subject to frequent police raids. As Mark explains about such a raid, which occurred in another language school in the city, his use of double voicing reveals how he assumes authority to speak for the Chinese police, mimicking them, and in the process implicitly criticizing them. He says the place got raided and all 4 teachers were sent home, deported. One of them was actually married to a Chinese national with a child. 27 police turned up at that school, locked the lifts, went up and arrested everybody in sight, including the Chinese staff. And why they wanted to do that is because they were afraid when they see a foreigner in there, they'd say, "What are you doing here?" To stop that, they arrested everybody and said, "Right, you're working illegally." Some within this group clearly felt threatened by some of the actions of the Chinese state. Some demonstrated anger or irritation that they were not treated with sufficient respect. Claudia's speech above about "because I am a foreigner" is a good example of this, where she inserts what she sees is the rationale used by the Chinese authorities for her lack of VPN access. She continues, "There's talk about they want to shut down all use of VPNs. That's my connection to my family and my friends. So like if I found out that that was getting taken away from me, I'd lose it, to be honest. And I think like, you want us to come to your country to provide either goods for whatever reasons or services. You want us to teach like English to your children. How would you feel if you couldn't talk to your children? So, that's how we feel when you take away these VPNs. Why do you think we're going to stay? We're not going to stay. And you think about how many English teachers are in this country. That's a lot of people. So if you're going to cut off their connection to their family, you can guarantee people are just going to be like, bye." Here, we can see how she double voices the Chinese state and the Chinese education policymakers and has an imaginary conversation with them in which she demonstrates power and status. But in reality, she does not have the power or status to ever have such conversations. So in the imagination of her authority, she reveals her lack of power in relation to the Chinese state and her frustration about the lack of perceived respect and voice given to foreigners. In a somewhat different example, which also intertwines authoritative and anticipatory double voicing, Mark displays authority through what he positions as his superior knowledge and understanding and held by the foreigners compared to the ignorance of the Chinese. In his talk about what he thinks Chinese people think, he shows linguistic expertise in using a double voice comment, which anticipates what Chinese students will think when they see a Black teacher. Oh, sorry, I think I've lost the, that's that one. His comment shows awareness of cultural assumptions demonstrated by some of his Chinese students and their parents, that the Chinese are superior and more developed, that all Black teachers are from Africa, and that Africa is a poor and less developed country. This quote indexes the speaker's self-reflexive ability to enter the world of his audience as a way of building authority, as well as expressing difference between us and them. So Mark says, although they don't admit it, the Chinese are actually quite racist. When they see a Black teacher, they think, well, I've seen pictures of Africa and we're more developed than they are. That's what they think. They use a word in Chinese called choker. They say the chocolate teacher. They use that word. So you're going to get this. A lot of people say racism, but I think this is down to ignorance. That's where it comes down to. So let's now look at the CV builders. The anticipatory type of double voicing may be used when a speaker wishes to deflect personal criticism of their abilities or actions. And it can also take the more assertive form of the preemptive strike, anticipating criticism from another speaker. Many of the teachers anticipated criticism connected with their ability to secure teaching posts on the grounds of their whiteness and native English speaking status. An example of this is George, the gap year volunteer teacher, who explained how he felt the occupation itself is bound up with voices of criticism from the Chinese authorities and some members of the public. It almost makes me feel embarrassed to be an English teacher because it comes with an assumption that it's not a particularly well qualified job, that you're not really taking that seriously as a professional person. However, George then goes on to correct this assumption by explaining the Chinese public do not understand ELT qualifications. Especially in China, for some reason, the Chinese consumer market doesn't really seem to be able to discriminate between qualified teachers and less qualified teachers. Double voicing was also used by the CV builders, who tended to be less confident about their teaching abilities and their position in China. And they used parody and mimicry to explain that their current situation had been inflicted on them by their Chinese employers. So Xiamen, the young American, explained that she struggled in her first teaching post because my main training, if you could call it training, was just to observe other teachers. Then I finally started getting my own classes, and then it was like, we're done, and now we can have you be useful. Shannon also uses corrective double voicing here to correct my understanding of her training and defend her role as a completely untrained English teacher put in charge of classes for which Chinese parents are spending a lot of money, as in part the fault of her employers. Once again, in her talk, Shannon uses parody and mimics the behavior of her employers. In a half hour, you can be told you have to teach a class, and some classes were 2 hours, and this would be a class you don't know. So you don't know the level, you don't know the behavior, and you're just kind of thrown in. And that's frustrating as a new teacher with very little experience. Finally, the tourist teachers. As unqualified teachers, often in very vulnerable situations, the tourist teachers demonstrated a heightened awareness that they're not perceived favorably by Chinese authorities. Many were on temporary visas and feared that they could be expelled without notice. Going to the police station for registration and visa issues was often described as an unpleasant experience, as Asli, the young Turkish teacher, explains. Her non-native speaker and non-white status have been additional factors for her to negotiate. And she notes somewhat bitterly that her white British and American colleagues are not usually concerned with these issues at all. In contrast, she feels she's subject to frequent harassment by the Security Bureau. She double voices the Chinese security officers who challenge her nationality and English-speaking status, using parody to represent their style, accenting their behavior with her indignation at the way she's treated. She says, I have to submit the paperwork for my permit every 6 months, and it's a nightmare. It's a total nightmare. Mine is due in a month, and every time we go there, we're almost totally harassed by the public security officers. They're not really fond of us. They just don't like foreigners. I mean, I might sound like I'm simplifying it, but really their behavior is the most unfriendly behavior I've ever seen. So it's interesting here that Asli anticipates that I might think she's oversimplifying, but she corrects my assumption by reiterating the parody with some humor. Indeed, as her story unfolds, parody, humor, and even burlesque are intertwined. She says, the last time I was there, I got asked the same questions again and again and again. And because they couldn't find anything, they went through the paperwork. And finally, The police officer asked whether my passport was fake. It's peculiar to law enforcement. We're treated like illegals without all the proper paperwork. It used to be once a year, but they changed the regulations. No explanation's been given, and now I get anxious. It's quite unfriendly. I don't know what's going to happen next. They just snap at us for no reason, at me. Similarly, Asley uses parody and burlesque to describe her Chinese employers. She says, I was told I was being boring and not entertaining enough. I was not smiling enough because I was miserable. So they told me to change my behavior. They gave me a warning, change your behavior or else. And I was almost sure that they'd made the decision no matter what I did. Okay, I'll just pull this together into some concluding thoughts. So hopefully the talks reveal the diversity between and within English language teachers. And this needs to be recognized as relating to multiple constructions of white migrant subjectivities and highly differentiated experiences of China, Chinese policies, and the Chinese authorities. Migrants seek subjective viability, but what I mean by that is viable ways of being themselves and having their identities recognized and valued by the host country and themselves. And I feel that the concept of double voicing helps to reveal diversity and how white migrant subjective positions in relation to China are both context-bound and contingent. Subjectivities and the meanings of whiteness are co-constituted through language and power in relation to the Chinese authorities. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Leonard, for fascinating talk. Now let's open the floor for questions. You can type the letter Q in the chat box and we'll call your name to ask a question, or you can also type your question directly in the chat box. And I have a question about the girl from Turkey, Asli.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You discuss whiteness, foreignness, but is she white or is she non-white? How do you position her?
She's non-white, although she her physiognomy is not as dark as obviously a black African. So she could pass as a Southern European. That's, you know, she had dark hair and darkish skin, so she would not be necessarily understood by the Chinese as being British or American or a native English speaker. So, but she positioned herself as non-white.
So is that the reason why she kept having visa problems or with the immigration officer? Is it because of her non-whiteness?
I think that you can't put it down to just one factor about her identity. She was totally unqualified. She was a non-native speaker. Mm-hmm. She came to China with no English language teaching qualifications. She'd learnt to speak English by watching British and American comedy shows on the internet. And she arrived in China, you know, under her own steam on a tourist visa. And so I feel it's the confluence of all those factors which make people vulnerable. Her non-whiteness certainly added to that, and put her, you know, in a way, if you had to put a spectrum of kind of power and status, then her non-whiteness would put her at the bottom of any kind of structure of power and status. But it wasn't just that. You know, you can find obviously Black teachers with good visas working in good schools. So it's not just down to her non-whiteness. And her, she was able to pass as white as well on occasion. She would tell me that she was regularly invited out by her Chinese students. They used to love going out with her in the evening. And to some of them, she was white. She spoke English with an American accent, and so they treated her as someone who was, totally cool and that they wanted to kind of hang out with. So, it depends which audience that you are considering when you consider her whiteness, which I think, really sort of underscores the flexibility and the fractured nature of whiteness, in that it can be constructed in totally different ways by different people.
Yeah, can you follow up with the flexibility of whiteness? Because my team, the China white team, we are really puzzled. What is whiteness in China? Does it translate into foreignness? To what extent they stick out as white, or are they just foreigners, like your title said, because I'm a foreigner? What's the relation between this whiteness and foreignness?
Well, yes. I mean, I think when you study the issue, as you and your team are, you do find a whole multiplicity of experiences by migrants of different kind of racial and ethnic backgrounds. And there is, in some parts of China and by some Chinese people, an adulation of whiteness. So you can find examples of white people being offered opportunities which are not offered to non-white people. Celebrity status and invitations to be models or appear in films or appear in advertisements, etc., as well as possibly being offered jobs. There's plenty of examples of white people walking down the street and being offered jobs in English language schools or wherever. So there is a fascination by some Chinese people into whiteness. And obviously there is a whole market in whitening creams, and many Chinese women protect their faces and protect their skin from becoming too dark. So there is a status and a salience afforded to whiteness. So I do think you can't just conflate whiteness with foreignness. It does need to be disentangled. But it's co-constituted. So it's the understandings of whiteness by Chinese people, and it's the understandings of whiteness by foreigners. And obviously everyone's understandings and experiences of whiteness are highly diverse.
Okay, thank you for the elaborate answer. I see a question from Simon Smith. Simon.
Oh yeah, hi there. Thank you very much indeed for that excellent presentation, Pauline. It was really appreciated. My sort of teaching, I teach in university at the moment, and my background in China has been teaching in universities there.
Oh, right.
And there's been, on the whole, I mean, dominated by people who one would describe, I suppose, as white, and often native speakers, although that's more kind of qualifications issue, but quite a few representatives of Asian and, indeed Chinese cultures and Black people, and on the whole, I'd say that probably the lived experience of, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but probably the lived experience of Asian colleagues or Chinese colleagues in, let's say, English teaching roles, academic roles in China, probably substantially different from the kind of experience, I might have, or indeed perhaps other BME or black people's lived experience. But it sort of seemed to me that, most of you had you only really had a couple of non-white contributors to your study.
Yes. Yeah.
So was it as much a reflection really on the lived experience of non-Chinese ELT teachers in China? They could have been more or less of any ethnicity, perhaps. And would it have been interesting also to compare to compare their experiences, because this is something that a lot of people have thought about, I think.
Yeah.
People that might well be mistaken for being from China, or people who are Asian and not perceived as foreign, might or might not be native speakers, and interesting to reflect on, I suppose, what their experiences are as well.
Yeah, no, I really totally agree. And as I said, to date I've only done 17 interviews, and then the research was left because I got another research project, but I would very much like to completely expand it, and interview people from a whole range of kind of diverse ethnicities and different nationalities. I think that would be really, really important to do.
Yeah.
There has been a bit of an obsession of kind of looking at whiteness, and what was interesting, I think, about this was that what instigated me into the research was the fact that in Xiamen, particularly at the time when I started the research, English language teachers, and most of these were white, were held in very poor regard. So I think, in some contention to many of the kind of sort of dominant narratives that whiteness is almost kind of seamlessly privileged, the Chinese context does challenge that view. And white migrants have a kind of whole range of experiences, and I think that's what I was trying to kind of convey, that it wasn't only the Turkish woman that had poor experiences. She certainly did, but many of the white unqualified or less qualified English teachers also had quite poor experiences, or experiences of discrimination and even persecution. So, I think Shantan's question about kind of what is whiteness in China is a really, really interesting one. But also, as you say, it needs to be put alongside what is blackness in China, and what is, non-native Chineseness in China. There's so many kind of fascinating routes that you could take this. And I have read some really interesting accounts of Chinese people that visit China, and feel very perplexed about their own identity, when perhaps they don't speak very good Chinese and they don't feel Chinese, and sort of certain attributes or identities are kind of mapped onto them. So there's multiple ways in which the research on international migrants needs to go.
Yeah, thank you.
So where are you working now, Simon? In Amsterdam, or
No, I'm in the UK now.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But yeah, anecdotally, I've learned over the years that particularly Chinese heritage people who perhaps don't speak Chinese, and perhaps are native speakers of English, might find themselves actually kind of discriminated against. And largely that's because some of the main stakeholders in all this, when it's the teaching of children that's involved, are the parents. And then there's that kind of perceived prestige of having a white kindergarten teacher, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for that answer.
Oh, thank you.
I see Michelle. Are you still there? Do you want to ask a question before you leave? Michelle Zhang.
Has she gone? Well, I can.
She's gone. Okay, Jean Lee has a question.
Okay.
Hello. So first of all, thank you so much for your sharing. It's really fascinating. And I'm a PhD student who's doing research about international migrants households in Guangzhou. So that's why I'm very interested in your findings and your data and all these fascinating ideas. And question. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I have one question is that I'm curious, like in your case, your participants, how would they refer themselves or I mean, like identify their status in China? So for example, like do they identify themselves as expatriates or maybe foreigners as like you're titled, or maybe change migrants or middling migrants or maybe other way. So I'm quite curious like how your participants identify themselves in their narrative accounts and how you see this, I mean, the words they use, the terminology. Thank you.
Well, that's a really interesting question. Certainly, in some of my former research, which I conducted in Hong Kong, most of my participants there referred to themselves as expats, expatriates. But in China, I've found that people rarely use that word. And I think there is often a tendency to kind of for migrants to refer to themselves by the terms in which they're positioned. And so in China, they are referred to as foreigners. So quite regularly, my participants would refer to themselves as foreigners, as in, you know, the initial quote and the title of the paper. So because the China called them foreigners, then they called themselves foreigners. And of course, you know, there's a real tension, I think, with some migrants in China that they, you know, can possibly live there for 30, 40 or 50 years. And they know that they will always be a foreigner. They'll never get a passport. They'll never get citizenship. And, you know, that sense of never seeing that there's any possibility of being a resident, even if they've got a Chinese spouse and Chinese children, means that they sort of perpetually kind of situate themselves as a foreigner, but often, you know, not really liking that. So I think it's a really interesting question, but I rarely found people situated themselves as expatriates, perhaps because not many of them get the terms and conditions traditionally associated with expatriate. So apart from my first category, the old professionals, who were given accommodation, flights home, paid leave, etc., that's the kind of typical expatriate package. None of the others had any of those kind of enjoyable conditions or benefits. So, you know, I didn't find that many talked to them that, you know, talked about themselves as expatriates. And, you know, in terms of your other kind of suggested categories, I suppose terms like middling migrants, that's quite an academic term. And I would perhaps see them as middling migrants, but they wouldn't necessarily know that, you know, that kind of conceptual term. And so I don't think they would refer to themselves as middling migrants.
Yeah, thank you. Because I always like curious the way how people identify themselves in this, like, I mean, the context of China, and especially when you mention the difference between maybe English teacher in Hong Kong, they might refer themselves as expats, and in mainland, maybe not really the case. So in this, I'm curious, maybe not, but I'm thinking, would that be because of the, as what you mentioned, the political, or I would say the visa type, or the way rather the person can be like see the place as the destination or not. So that might be one of the consideration maybe. And I read some papers from Dr. Kuhn's, Dr. Sarah Kuhn's, and she have the debate about like the image of also that's originally is from a newspaper that Guardians published as an article about like there any whiteness and elite image of the term expatriates. So that's I'm thinking like, would this difference and context and the image that relate together? How do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I've written quite a bit on that myself in the past about how the term expatriate is bound up with whiteness and privilege, and someone who's enjoying kind of good conditions and benefits. And I think, you know, I very much enjoy Sarah's work as well. And I think the term is, you know, sort of becoming outdated because very few people have those benefits anymore. So when people get sent abroad to work, I mean, less and less people do get sent abroad to work because we can all do it over the internet now. But when they do get sent abroad, they're less likely to be given the kind of elite status or provided with the kind of infrastructure which expatriates sort of were bubbled into a kind of separate infrastructure where they were sort of able to maintain their home national identity. And I think, you know, times are changing and politics are changing and people are less comfortable with using that word, expatriate. So, you know, what's interesting about in the Hong Kong situation is that, you know, because the Chinese often called them expatriates, then they might call themselves expatriates themselves, or the Chinese in Cantonese might call them Guilo, and then they would refer to themselves as Guilos. And so, you know, it's interesting how kind of language is appropriated and kind of modified. So, you know, there's so many multiple uses, I think, of the word expat, and it can be used, you know, in terms of kind of looking at the language that I've done today. It can be used in terms of parody or mimicry, you know, or humor, you know, making fun of it. So, you know, people might sort of say, oh, I'm just an expat, but they're kind of using it ironically, or meaning that they're not just an expat, you know. So I think you have to kind of look carefully at how people are using the term.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No,
Thanks
you're
a lot.
welcome. It's lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Any other questions?
I see there's some things in the chat. Shan Sam, I don't know whether there's something from Gwen Bennett. I don't know whether Gwen is there.
It's some sharing, it's not a question.
Oh, okay.
People are sharing their experiences.
Yeah, that's really nice to see.
Willie, can you save the chat? Maybe you can send it to Pauline.
Yes, it will be saved, yes. I could ask a question if there's no question going around right now. If you don't mind, Pauline, I was just wondering, like, now with COVID happening, I'm following some of these groups on WeChat with people who want to go back to China,
Right.
and seeing that for some than others, like, I wonder, like, what do you expect? What type of shift will happen? Because it's so nice to see those categories, you know, to see the diversity, kind of how you analyze the diversity in this group. I think it's very helpful for us. I wonder, like, what will the future look like? Will there maybe be less diversity because there's some categories that might have difficulty returning to China?
Yes, that's a really, really good question. And I'm not sure I can answer it really. I think, you know, the Chinese-Western relations have changed and are changing considerably. And there's a certain amount of kind of xenophobia probably on both sides. So I know that, you know, some international migrants in China have, you know, received quite a bit of hostility and discrimination and been refused service, for example, and chucked out of shops and restaurants. And so You know, whether quite so many young people, for example, will want to go to China, I think is a you know, really interesting question. At the moment, nobody can go anywhere, so it's all academic at the moment. Whether it will be on the Chinese side that they will clamp down, you know, even more on lack of qualifications and lack of you know, legal status, and you know, sort of track the provenance of migrants a bit more carefully in terms of who can come into China. I think, you know, I very much think that your group are going to be doing really important work in this space, because hopefully you can have the ability to kind of track some of these issues. But it would be really, really interesting to see how the diversity in international migrants plays out in the post-COVID space, as well as, you know, from the destination countries, what people feel about going back to China, or feel about visiting China in the first place. You know, the sort of geopolitical world is just changing so dramatically, isn't it? So I think that's a really, really interesting question. I don't know whether you've got any reflections from your work in how you think that post-COVID China is changing.
I think thus far it looks like it's a little bit more difficult to return without having like very serious credentials.
Yeah.
With a serious contract. I also see in the chat a few people are responding, saying that they have indeed gotten either stuck abroad or and some have also had partners stuck in China, not being able to go out, so stuck on either side.
Yes.
And Xiamen says maybe more teaching offline. So also referring to our PhD, Raviv Lippmann's current focus, actually, the move to the online teaching because of COVID.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, but there's a study there, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Can I ask one more question?
Cool.
I have so many questions. You mentioned the concept of native capital. So can you give some examples of a native capital? Is it just English language or other things related to one's nationality? And also,
yes.
I have a second part. How does this native capital play out differently for Black teachers and white teachers?
I think native capital also applies to knowledge of culture, and that's a very kind of wide and diverse area. So it includes knowledge of pop music, for example, British pop music or American pop music, humor, you know, comedy, films, food, all of that is native capital. So it's kind of competence across a whole kind of cultural spectrum, and that's deemed to be important as well. So you know, some Chinese parents want their children to be totally proficient in Western culture, whether that's British, American, Canadian, Australian, or wherever, and that includes you know, sort of knowledge of politics, of comedy, of humor, of food, etc. So that native capital is much wider than just English language, in my view. And of course, you know, what is important about your question, particularly in terms of Britain and America, which are two of the most multicultural countries in the world, is that being British doesn't equate to being white. And so, you know, there are many, many British people, obviously, from a whole range of diverse ethnicities and cultural backgrounds, who have both the knowledge of white Britain, as well as knowledge of, you know, other Britons, whether that be Black or Asian or Chinese or whatever. So, you know, that whether those teachers whether there's interest in, you know, those cultures, the multicultural aspects of Britain or America by Chinese parents and Chinese children is a really interesting question. You know, I don't know the answer to it because I haven't done research on Black teachers' experiences in China or Asian teachers' experiences in China. But you know, that confusion that Britishness equals whiteness or Americanness equals whiteness is one that prevails in many Chinese schools, perhaps particularly in the rural areas. And so, you know, that confusion is something that those teachers have to negotiate. So I would love to do research on that, but, you know, I don't want to be put in the position of speaking for a group that I haven't done research on.
Okay, thanks. And I think Raviv has a question. Raviv.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for the presentation, Pauline. It was very wonderful to see. And the presentation and the discussion that's been going on has been really great for me to hear because, as you know, I'm studying also the topic.
Yeah.
And
I really enjoyed your paper. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about the this thing about ELT teachers' diversity, which I think is very interesting in the way you've structured it. Do you think that there is connections between the categories, or are they largely disconnected from each other? Or to put it differently, since they're categorized in age groups, are these things that people might go through at different stages, or which the people you interviewed at the later stages were largely disconnected from the people at the earlier stages?
That's a really, really good question. And I'm really glad you've asked it, actually, because I did sort of toy with the typology, and that, you know, the trouble with typologies is that they can appear to be quite fixed. And I think what's important is that there is real flexibility between and within the different kinds of categories or groups or types, if you like. And so, you know, it is highly possible that one would start off in one category and end up in another. So, you know, the new professionals, if they're there long enough, they will become old professionals. And some of the CV builders, even the tourist teachers like John, the Canadian, he now has actually been there for 10 years and works in a really good school. And so you would now probably also categorize him as a new professional. So I think there is real flexibility, and people do move between the groups. And it could be a life course thing, you're right. But obviously lots of people will come and go. So you're unlikely to lose your educational qualifications. So you're unlikely to kind of, you know, start bumping down, but something could happen and you would, you know, so you can become out of favor, and then, you know, you might start to lose your status. So I think that's a really important question. So thank you for asking it.
So are those four categories are the ideal types or for analytical?
The analytical types, yes,
Yeah,
certainly not necessarily ideal types, but analytical types, yes. From my sample, you know, that's how the differences kind of revealed themselves, yes.
Okay. I have one more question. I think it's really important because one of the guy, Mark, he mentioned Chinese are racist, right? He said something about Black people. And you also mentioned some teachers, if their China experience is not that good, they feel they're being discriminated. You even use the word they are persecuted. So how do you understand this discrimination against the foreigners or against the white people in China? Shall we call it racism? Or is discrimination the right word? Or is there another word? Because it's very common when we study migrants from the South migrating to the North, right? It seems discrimination, racism is the norm.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in China, there seems to be, a reverse. I don't know. So how do you compare these two, south to north migration, north to south migration? Are they the same or are they different?
So you're talking about south to north and north to south discrimination against different ethnicities within China, are you?
Discrimination against foreigners.
Oh, against foreigners.
Foreign migrants, foreign teachers.
Yes, yes. Yes, I mean, certainly white people noticing discriminatory treatment towards their Black colleagues describe that as racism. Many white Westerners are unused to using the term racism in relation to whiteness. And I think it's complex to use that term in relation to whiteness, because although there may be instances of discrimination and instances of marginalization, they're usually not systematic, and the kind of term has emanated from structural kind of inequalities between the races in the West. And I think it's an interesting question whether you can deploy a concept which is being developed in a Western context to understand a Western concept within China, where that concept has not been developed. So I think it's an important question as to whether you can apply one theoretical tool, a Western theoretical tool, to describe race relations in China. So I wouldn't necessarily use that term because I come from a UK context where racism is used in quite specific instances, and to just deploy it without kind of really thinking about it very carefully into another context is something I would feel a bit uneasy to do. But that's not to say that migrants in China from all racial backgrounds do experience, some do experience discrimination and xenophobia. I think perhaps xenophobia would be a better word.
Great. I think we have one last question. Okay, it's from Ginny Long. Have you ever encountered someone who does not care about their foreign identity? What terms people will use to address them? So have you encountered any participants who doesn't care how Chinese people address them? Based on my own understanding and daily observation, some of the white and non-white foreigners may take it as a context issue, do not care about being called a foreigner.
I think that's a really interesting question, Ginny, and I suppose it's one of the aspects of research in an interview situation is that when you're inviting people to reflexively consider something, then it gives the impression that they have thought about it or they are thinking about it, and therefore do care about it. So in my experience, I did not meet anyone who did not care about what the Chinese might think about them. I think one of the interesting aspects about studying migration is that through the migration process, most migrants are kind of forced in a way to consider themselves, to consider how they're going to settle in the new context and how people are responding to them. And so, it might be considered by just observing people that they don't care. But I think you would have to kind of ask them. I'm interested that you think that people don't care, and I wonder what's behind that question. Actually, I don't know whether Ginny is there, because it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about what she means by the question.
Ginny, can you turn on your camera? Do you want to say something?
I don't know whether I've answered the question there.
I don't know whether she's still there.
Yeah, maybe not. No.
But thank you so much. That's very inspiring Q&A session.
Yes, I'd really like to have a look at the chat. So hopefully that will be.
Yeah, let's ask Willie's here to save all the chat.
I don't know whether she can send it to me, because I'd like to
Yeah,
comment.
we'll
Yeah, they look really.
we'll send it to you. Thank you so much for a
you.
wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I really love the way you answer questions. Very clear. Also very nuanced, very thoughtful.
Thank you, Xiamen, and thank you very much for asking me. It's lovely to meet the group again, and I hope I have the opportunity to meet you again soon.
Yes, we'll keep in touch for the special issue.
Yeah, okay, lovely.
Thank you.